Wow, Sarah, you're up early. I called out to my granddaughter Sarah, who was unusually sitting up in bed. Today, Sarah's mother had to leave suddenly for a business trip, and her father had dashed off, saying he had golf. It's nice weather today, so maybe it's a good idea to go to the park a little further away than usual. However, when I spoke, Sarah turned to look at me, her small eyebrows furrowed. "Grandma, is it okay for adults to lie?" she asked, tilting her head. Taken aback by the sudden question, I must have looked confused, but then I remembered scolding Sarah for lying yesterday. Assuming it was a continuation of that conversation. "Of course not," I answered. But Sarah seemed unsatisfied with that answer. "But, Mom said..." At the sudden mention of another person, I was puzzled. But then, as if presenting evidence, Sarah showed me a recording on her mobile phone, and my expression changed. "See? I'm Jessica, a 64-year-old part-time worker at a supermarket. I've lived an ordinary life since I was young, and at 22, I married a man named Michael through an introduction by my parents. I wasn't positive about the marriage at first, but it brightened up my life. Michael, who was much older, always respected and adored me. He would always ask what I wanted to eat, where I wanted to go, and encouraged me when I struggled with unfamiliar household chores. At that time, there was a strong expectation that women should perfectly manage all household tasks, but Michael never said such a thing. He would always pat my head when I made mistakes, saying, "It's okay." He even took to the kitchen willingly. I had strongly thought that I was compromising with this marriage, but it was only a matter of time before I was genuinely attracted to Michael. Eventually, we became a famously close couple in the neighborhood. It was a very fulfilling marriage, but there was one thing that troubled me. We couldn't seem to have children. Michael liked children and always adored the little ones in the neighborhood. So, I wanted to give him his own child and, more than anything, wanted to expand our family. But the miracle we hoped for did not come easily. After 5 years, overwhelmed by physical discomfort, I rushed to the hospital and heard something completely unexpected. "Congratulations, you're pregnant." Michael was overjoyed. After spinning me around in happiness, he suddenly turned pale, exclaiming, "What have I done to your precious body?" Watching him, I laughed and felt the happiest moment of my life. But the seat of the happiest moment was soon taken by another event. After 10 months, the life that had lived with me finally came into our arms. Michael and I cried tears of joy together. We named our precious child Richard. Richard was born smaller than average, but grew up healthy. Every word and action of Richard's was a source of joy and concern for both Michael and me. I believed those blissful days would continue forever. I remember that day clearly. The rare phone call that came to the house. Michael's colleague's panicked voice, and then the harsh reality that he would never return to us. Even 2 months after his funeral, I was still in a daze. It was an accident at work. So sudden, so abrupt. That's why I kept feeling like he would come back any moment, and stood at the entrance holding Richard. But it wasn't Michael who came. A man from his workplace came to visit, leaving some condolence money in my hands before swiftly leaving. Such things could never replace his presence. The moment I thought that, the reality that he was gone hit me hard. I found myself crying out loud, face down on the floor. What brought me back to reality from my despair was Richard. Sitting on the cold floor, huddled up, Richard looked at me and placed his small hand on my head. The warmth from his touch stopped my tears. It was always Michael who comforted me this way, placing his hand on my head whenever I cried. I always felt protected by his large hands. But he was no longer here. I could no longer afford to be weak. I had to become the protector, the comforter for someone much more vulnerable and smaller than myself. Holding Richard, I let out what I decided would be my last tears in life. From then on, my days were filled with juggling work and raising Richard. Time flew by frighteningly fast. Richard, who had grown both in mind and body in the blink of an eye, became independent when he went to college and moved out for a job. Even though it was just the next state over, a mere 30-minute drive if you had a car, I couldn't help but feel lonely and worried. But he's Michael's son, he'll be fine. Telling myself that, I watched over him without interfering much. Eventually, Richard surpassed the age at which we had him. He seems to be doing well at work. While working part-time at a local supermarket for living expenses, I eagerly await any news from my son. One day, I received a call from Richard. He said he wanted to come home soon because there was someone he wanted to introduce to me. We set a date for the near future, and after hanging up, I muttered, "Finally, my child has." That day, I visited Michael's grave to report the news. Then, on the next Saturday, when Richard was supposed to come home, I waited in the living room with an uneasy feeling. I rushed to the door while smoothing my hair at the sound of the doorbell. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find Richard with a slightly nervous expression and an unfamiliar woman. "I'm home," Richard said in a brusque tone, while the woman, with her mouth tightly shut, didn't say a word as she looked at me. I couldn't help but be a little concerned about her attitude, but welcomed them into the living room anyway. I served coffee along with some snacks I had prepared. As I took my seat, Richard immediately began introducing the woman sitting next to him. "Mom, this is Dorothy. I'm planning to marry her." I smiled at Dorothy, introducing myself. There was no smile or word from Dorothy in return. Richard and Dorothy had met through an acquaintance, and it turns out Dorothy was 6 years younger than him. I was surprised to hear she was still a college student. From a societal perspective, it might be considered a marriage with an age difference, but having been significantly younger than Michael myself, it didn't bother me. While I had some concerns about Dorothy, marriage is foremost about respecting each other's feelings. With that thought, I offered my blessings with a smile. Richard and Dorothy got married shortly thereafter. A few days later, I was startled by the fact Richard awkwardly revealed over the phone after I casually mentioned, "So, no wedding party then?" "Actually, Dorothy's pregnant. Considering that, we really don't have the money." I was shocked to learn that Dorothy had already been pregnant on the day they came to greet me. More so, they had decided to marry in a hurry after discovering her pregnancy, and to visit me. Furthermore, Richard said, "With the baby coming, our current income just won't cut it. We'll have to move. So, I was wondering, could we possibly live with you, Mom?" And proposed. I've always made it a principle in my upbringing to respect my son's decisions and the consequences they bring. However, the complete lack of planning on their part gives me a headache. "But I don't have the means either. And is Dorothy okay with this?" "Dorothy wants to do this as well." I couldn't help but let out a big sigh. Considering the well-being of my unborn grandchild, perhaps it's better to accept their proposal. But truly, I don't have much leeway either. Even though I work, it's just a part-time job, and I'm not exactly swimming in money or time. Besides, the house Michael bought, while reasonably spacious, was originally meant for 3 people. If Richard and his wife and child were to live here, Michael's study, which has been carefully maintained for decades, would inevitably have to go. Even though it seemed selfish, I felt strong resistance to losing the study I cherished. In the end, I put off giving an answer and hung up the phone. But I immediately regretted not expressing my opinion clearly. A few months after their marriage, around the time Dorothy was about to enter the 10th month of pregnancy, Unexpectedly, our doorbell rang when no deliveries were scheduled. Confused, I answered the door only to be astounded beyond words. There stood a moving company worker, smiling. The young man, removing his hat to greet me, stood in front of a large truck. Having had no plans for a move, I questioned what this was about. He repeatedly checked his device, puzzled, saying it was Richard's request and that this house was specified as their new home. I was speechless, experiencing shock for the second time that day. Regaining my composure, I apologized to the mover and urgently called Richard. After a few rings, Richard answered. "Oh, did the stuff arrive? I'm on my way there now." As if it were a fact. "I wasn't informed. And I haven't agreed to you living in our house." I found myself yelling over the phone, to which Richard sounded apologetic. "But Dorothy wanted to move in while she was in the hospital. She thought you'd be happy you could live with your grandchild." I was speechless at the audacity. It turned out, the previous residence was already canceled and vacated. As much as I couldn't forgive this action, I couldn't turn away my son and his family, about to welcome a baby. Thus, I reluctantly agreed to live together. Soon after, Dorothy, having given birth, moved in, and our household of 4 began. The baby was born without any issues. Her name is Sarah. Holding my finger in her small hand, I am moved by affection. There's no blame on Sarah, and if this child grows up healthy and happy, perhaps there's meaning in giving up the cherished study. With that thought, I stood up to tidy up the kitchen. Since the start of our cohabitation, all household chores, cooking, laundry, cleaning, have fallen to me. Early on, I have to take care of the baby and work part-time. If I did housework too, I'd collapse. "Jessica, you'll handle the chores, right?" Dorothy declared, and since then, I've reluctantly accepted it. Not just Dorothy, but Richard too, took it for granted to leave all household tasks to me. With one adult becoming 3, the workload more than doubled, and items like baby bottles require extra care. While tirelessly managing everything for Sarah's well-being, I held back my sighs. 3 years later, Dorothy announced at dinner that she finally got a job. "I was able to get a job at a trading company through a friend from college. Please let me stay with you until I get used to the job." Without showing any sign of apology, Dorothy said this to me, and I replied with resignation. But that wasn't the only thing she wanted. "And since I'll be working, I'd like you to take care of Sarah during my work hours." I raised my eyebrows at that and objected. "I have a job too. If we're both working, we can use a childcare center. Why pay for childcare when it's just a part-time job? You could look after her for free. And it's such a hassle to find one." I glanced at Richard, who simply said, "Sorry," and looked away. It seemed Dorothy really intended to leave Sarah and go to work, with no intention of looking for a childcare center. Richard's attitude was as if it wasn't his concern. I couldn't just leave 3-year-old Sarah alone, so I negotiated with my employer to somehow change my shifts. Fortunately, they were understanding and adjusted my shifts so I could arrange the environment before Dorothy started her job. Sarah, who didn't mind spending long hours with me, was actually quite happy. Her curiosity made every activity sparkle her eyes, a delightful granddaughter. Initially, we spent the days making snacks and taking naps. But worrying about the lack of interaction with peers since we weren't going to a childcare center, I started taking her to the park and for walks more actively. Sarah, who was shy at first and hid behind me, eventually joined in and played happily with other children in the park. I watched this fondly. This routine continued for about 4 years, until Sarah started elementary school. There were several arguments with Richard and Dorothy, but their attitude didn't change. Even after Sarah started school, returning to my old life wasn't immediate, and I continued to work shorter shifts to be there when Sarah came home. One day, I waited for Sarah to return at the front door. She came back, swinging her hat joyfully, and screamed immediately after opening the door when she saw me standing there. I said sternly, "Sarah, you haven't given Grandma the important notice from your teacher, have you?" Sarah's eyes widened as if she remembered. But then she looked away and clumsily lied. "I don't know. There wasn't any." Of course, I already knew since the teacher had called me directly. I grabbed Sarah's shoulders with both hands and scolded her. "Lying is wrong. You could lose friends that way." Sarah's eyes teared up, and she apologized in a small voice. Scolding or indulging Sarah was clearly my role. As Richard and Dorothy had left all aspects of parenting to me over these 4 years. I patted Sarah's head after she apologized quickly and told her, "I've prepared a snack, so go wash your hands." Sarah ran off towards her room with a relieved face. Watching her back, I thought about whether I should encourage more interaction between her and her parents, since it wasn't good for Sarah or them in the long run. Tomorrow was a day off, after all. But my plan was immediately shattered. "I'll be going on a business trip with a colleague starting tomorrow, so I'm counting on you to take care of Sarah," Dorothy announced at dinner. Richard seemed surprised too, as if this was news to him. "Tomorrow is a Saturday. And is a business trip decided that quickly?" I asked Dorothy incredulously. I couldn't work much during the week and had my shifts on the weekend. Suddenly being told this, I couldn't manage. However, Dorothy snorted as if mocking me. "Don't act like you know. I work properly at a trading company, so of course this happens. But I have work tomorrow, and the day after too," I said, looking at Richard, who avoided my gaze. Frowning, Richard mumbled, "I have golf tomorrow. Can't cancel." I felt the same way. I couldn't cancel either. However, I noticed Sarah looking anxious beside me. I bit my almost open lips, sighed, and closed my eyes. Thus, I ended up taking the next day off work. The next morning, Dorothy left the house early, seeming uplifted. Richard also left early, as if fleeing. When I went to wake Sarah, she was unusually already awake. "Good morning, Sarah. You're up early today," I said, and Sarah, who was sitting on the bed with her back to me, turned around. After I stroked her messy hair, Sarah spoke. "Hey, Grandma. Is it okay for adults to lie unlike children?" "Huh? What's up all of a sudden?" Surprised, I remembered scolding her for lying the day before and wondered if this was a continuation. While puzzled by her train of thought, I answered Sarah's question. Of course, adults shouldn't lie either. However, Sarah looked dissatisfied with the answer. "But, Mom..." I was puzzled by her sudden mention of Dorothy. Sarah, looking frustrated with me, said, "Listen to this," and handed me her mobile phone. Sarah, who often had to stay home alone due to my work schedule, had been given a child-friendly mobile phone at the time of her enrollment. It only allows limited app usage, but I was impressed by how well Sarah could use it without being taught. The mobile phone she handed me displayed the recording app's playback screen. Seeing it made me frown. "You promised Grandma not to secretly listen to people's conversations using this." Yes, Sarah had been scolded by me for placing her mobile phone in my room with the recording app activated, which I had found. She seemed to have wanted to imitate a detective from a popular comic, and had cried while promising never to do it again. But Sarah, on the verge of tears, exclaimed, But, Mom is always talking to someone at night, and I thought it might be a ghost, so I had to become a detective." I tilted my head at her words. Richard and Dorothy's bedrooms are separate, and Dorothy uses what was originally a study on her own. Dorothy refuses even Richard entering her room, which makes it unlikely she talks to him every night. Sensing my anger drifting away, Sarah quickly pressed the playback button. I tried to stop her in a panic, but the voice that came out made me freeze. "I'm so excited about our overnight date tomorrow." "Huh? We're lying to our husbands that it's just a business trip. We're not naughty. It's okay because we're adults." The voice coming from the mobile phone was unmistakably Dorothy's. But its content was unbelievable. Stunned, Sarah spoke to me. "See, Mom says it's okay for adults to lie." Sarah, still young, hardly understood the conversation, picking up only that part. I instinctively hugged Sarah and took a deep breath. Then, trying to keep my voice from shaking, I told her breakfast was ready and to go to the living room. When I told her we're having French toast today, Sarah threw her mobile phone and happily ran off. After she was out of sight, I took out my own mobile phone from my pocket. Time passed, and it was Sunday night. "I'm home." Dorothy came back in a good mood after Sarah had already gone to bed. Richard's face tensed as he drank coffee in the living room. I hid in the shadows of the kitchen, out of view from the living room. Dorothy, unaware, peered into the living room, saw us, and headed towards her room. However, Richard called her name, stopping her. "Dorothy, come here, please." Dorothy, looking puzzled, obediently sat at the dining table. "What is it?" "I'm tired from the business trip." Richard's face hardened at those words. He began gravely. "You're having an affair, aren't you?" On Saturday morning, after listening to the conversation recorded on Sarah's mobile phone, I immediately contacted Richard. He listened to the recording as soon as he got back. "What are you talking about?" Dorothy responded nonchalantly. She seemed intent on playing ignorant. To that, Richard pulled something out of his pocket. Dorothy, wary, followed it with her eyes. What Richard took out was Sarah's mobile phone. Noticing it, Dorothy seemed to let her guard down a bit, showing a slight relief. However, her complexion changed the moment Richard operated the mobile phone and pressed the playback button. "I really love you. My husband has been so unbearable lately." "What is this?" Dorothy tried to snatch the mobile phone from Richard's hand, but was avoided. The mobile phone continued to play unbearable content. The voice of a man, presumably the person on the phone, could be heard occasionally, indicating Sarah's mobile phone was close by. Unable to take the mobile phone, Dorothy, her face turning red, began to tremble. Then she shouted loudly, "Yes, I was cheating! What's wrong with that? Let me have a little fun! I'm at the end of my 20s, after all!" I was speechless at her unexpected admission. Richard seemed the same, silent for a moment, but then stood up from his chair, resolved to face Dorothy. "Dorothy, we're getting a divorce." "Huh? I won't accept that." Dorothy, not understanding her position, complained to Richard. That's when I came out of the kitchen and confronted her, shocked, with the mobile phone. "I've got your admission of cheating recorded right here." With both me and Richard glaring at her, Dorothy weakly sat down in the chair. Then, I also sat down, and a discussion ensued. Richard demanded a divorce, custody, and compensation from Dorothy. And I also told her to leave this house. Dorothy screamed something, but when Richard mentioned he had already consulted a lawyer, she paled and looked down. The next day, formal negotiations seemed to have taken place with a lawyer present. I heard that Dorothy, who had been resistant until the end, eventually agreed to all demands. Since Richard and I refused to live with Dorothy in the same house any longer, Dorothy left the house with minimal belongings. I told Sarah, who looked confused as she watched, that she might not see her mother as often anymore. Sarah, looking anxious, furrowed her brows and clung to my clothes, asking, "Can I still see you, Grandma?" I hugged Sarah and nodded deeply. "Of course. I'll always be here in this house." "Then it's okay." My heart ached at Sarah's words. I didn't want to make Sarah sad, but seeing her not cry over not being able to see her mother made me feel the thinness of their bond, which was sad. And then, I had a serious talk with Richard. I scolded him for always being submissive to Dorothy and not properly engaging with Sarah, and told him that if things remained the same, he should leave too. Richard, with a grim face, said, "I understand. I really reflected on this matter. I've been neglecting to think for myself all this time." He apologized for leaving everything up to me until now. And then he begged, "Once I can support Sarah on my own, I'll definitely leave. Can we live together as three for a little while longer?" I believed Richard's words and accepted them. Dorothy, having been kicked out of our house, ran to her lover's place only to encounter his wife. Turns out, her lover was also married. Naturally, his wife was furious and called her husband, who was still at work. Because she revealed everything to a colleague of her husband who tried to take the call, the affair between Dorothy and her lover spread through the company in an instant. After receiving disciplinary action from their company, it was discovered that they had taken unnecessary business trips for their rendezvous multiple times. As a result, Dorothy and her lover were effectively fired and had no choice but to leave the company. After such a debacle, it was unsurprising that the two quickly parted ways. However, breaking up did not exempt Dorothy from her responsibilities, and she had to pay compensation to Richard in addition to alimony demanded by her lover's wife. Having left her previous job for such reasons, she found it difficult to secure new employment and is now said to be working in the nightlife industry. Richard, who shared this story with me, struggles daily with household chores and childcare. Thanks to Richard's efforts in research and procedures, Sarah was able to enter preschool, allowing me almost to return to my original work situation. Although Richard, who had not been properly involved until now, faces rejection from Sarah in many instances, it seems they are awkwardly building a new relationship. How about we go to this amusement park together next time? Well, okay. While they looked over a pamphlet for an amusement park in the next state, I watched them with a smile and sipped my coffee.